IronOverLoad.io, hardcore episode 12. We're going right along on this one. Today we're going to be talking about Nandrolone Phenylpropionate, NPP, which is the short-acting version of Nandrolone. Stevesmi, aka Steve Smith, and Da Mobster joining me from across the pond. What's up?
All right there, Stevie boy. As you know, I am a big fan of Deca for a variety of reasons. NPP is not something I specifically use, but like Steve said, quicker in, quicker peak, quicker out. So yeah, this is one we're going to get into, and we're going to address some of the Deca points associated with NPP as well.
Yeah, so Nandrolone, basically Nandrolone Phenylpropionate. You have two main types of Nandrolone that are sold by sources. You have the Deca Durabolin version, the Nandrolone Decanate, which has a 15-day half-life. This shorter acting Nandrolone, which is the one we're going to talk about today, Nandrolone Phenylpropionate, NPP, has only a 4.5-day half-life. So right off the bat, what is the difference between the two? Well, when you talk about 4.5-day half-life, I always have a general rule of about 5, multiplying it by 5, which is when it reaches peak levels in your body. So if you take 4.5 multiplied by 5, NPP will be peaking in your body, assuming you inject it on a correct regular schedule, which should be about 3 times a week. And you'll have, after about 22.5 days, it reaching peak in your body. So that's not long. So 3 weeks into it, you're reaching peak in your body. Now, the long-acting Nandrolone, which most people are familiar with, we're talking 75 days to reach peak in the body. That is a long time. So that's like over 10 weeks for it to reach peak in your body. So the advantage of running NPP is it's into your system quicker, and it's out of your system when you stop it also quicker. So you can recover much easier from it. If something goes wrong on cycle and you want to stop using it, you can stop using it. It'll be out of your system much faster than running the long version of Nandrolone. So Nandrolone Phenylpropionate, look, at the end of the day, it was been around a long time. We're talking at least since the 60s, introduced for therapeutic use. Look, during the golden age of bodybuilding, they loved using Nandrolones back then. The reason they liked using Nandrolones is because they had low androgenic issues. They had low side effects. They were mild. They did not aromatize into estrogen. And that was huge in those days because they didn't have access to anti-estrogens, estrogen blockers, and all that good stuff that we have access today. So for them, using a Nandrolone would have been better than using testosterone for that reason. So it's like testosterone, but it's got a structural change. And the modification of that testosterone hormone was changed to make it more anabolic and less androgenic, very, very, very less androgenic. And you're not going to get that heavy aromatization as you would. It's going to aromatize a fifth as much or a fourth as much, somewhere in there, as much as straight testosterone. So technically, you don't even need an AI when you run Deca, if you were to technically run Deca, by itself. So, and listen, at the end of the day, were they using NPP? Not really. They were using the long ester of the Nandrolone back in those days, because another big taboo in those days was needles, injecting. Because back then, look, if you had needles around your house and you were injecting yourself, you were considered a junkie in those days. Drugs was really frowned upon back in those days during the 60s and 70s. And they were putting people in prison for a long time for using drugs, especially in the United States. That was, that was the era where the war on drugs really, really started. So it was really taboo to be injecting yourself very often. So if you could get away from injecting yourself with the long ester Nandrolone, Deca Durabolin, once a week or even once every 2 weeks, that would be a hell of a lot easier than having to inject 2-3 times a week with the short acting NPP. So, but NPP in the past 10, 20 years has caught up to Deca Durabolin because people really enjoy Mobster having that quicker effect in the body and having it out of your system quicker as well, which will really make it easier to recover from after your cycle.
I'll jump in here, Steve. Something that you say. Can you imagine, guys? I've never, but again, it was a sus Deca cycle, so I'm using other forms of testosterone. Sus, as you know, is multiple esters at the same time as Deca, and getting all the wonderful benefits from those two combined. But there's no, I can't think of anything where I'd want to run 75 days to get, that in and out of the system. And that's just crazy, because when I came off the sus and the Deca together, dropped quite a bit of weight, specifically, I think, from the sus, Steve. And again, it was one of those times when I wasn't trying to retain a load of tissue from 280 to 300 pounds. Something I want to address here, Steve, which I think is super, super important. And it doesn't matter whether it's on NPP, the shorter acting version, or Deca on the long acting version. Now, Deca by reputation, and I'll address Deca because the same thing applies, is this idea, and the article that we're using as a reference here actually refers to it. There's a suggestion in studies only that there is some uptake of collagen synthesis. And what that essentially means is that your fascia, your connective tissues, etc., and to a smaller degree, protein in the muscles, there's a small increase. But it seems to only really happen in the science studies versus what you and I would call the real world, Steve. And that's the difference between pharmaceutical, medically prescribed situations in a controlled study versus athletes using performance enhancing levels, which are always going to be higher dosages, and in the real world. So what does that mean in simple terms, guys? If you have an injury, and I'm thinking, for example, Steve, a real good example, we see this a lot, and we see examples from myself and on the forums. If you've got issues with your shoulder joint, it can be other joints, but I'm just using this as an example, guys. And you decide to use either Deca or NPP because you've heard that in a study, it helped with that collagen synthesis. It helped with injury repair. In reality, Steve, performance enhancing terms, it doesn't. As Steve said in the pre-show, if you've got bulging disc, it's not going to fix your disc. If you've got a worn or broken shoulder, it's not going to fix your shoulder. It's just not. What it will do, and what both NPP and Deca will do, and again, this is great for in a situation, is a reduction in pain. And indeed, just this week, on one of the forums, came up with one of the members very thoughtfully posted up a study, and it said, this is Deca study, see what you guys think. And the specific thing that caught my eye, speed reading through the study, the controls, how they did it, etc., down to the results, was that the perception of reduction in pain, I believe, was around 70%, Steve. It was towards the older users, which we're going to get into very momentarily. But that's a feeling or a sensation on the pain measure on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being no pain and 10 being god awful, shoot me now. Any drug that's reducing pain in guys with injuries, etc., is going to be a good thing. But it's, again, that perception of a reduction in pain versus actually fixing the joint. So, guys, as always in this situation, masking the pain, taking the pain away, doesn't mean that the issue's been resolved. So you will feel good on Deca. You'll feel, there's even an argument, I believe, Steve, for a small increase in synovial fluid for the lubrication, but it will come back to normal after the fluid will come out of the joint. The pain will go back to normal levels, and the joint, especially if you've been banging away in the gym because you didn't have as much pain, will actually be worse than it was before. And that's just simply because you're using it in a gym and not in a study, and you haven't got an ongoing issue that's been medically prescribed for. Something else, Steve, and you and I talked about this, the difference between the under 40s and the over 40s in terms of their experience on Deca. So I'll let Steve address the under 40s and Deca Dick, and I'll address the over 40s. So the reality of the situation is, when it comes to nature, us 35, 40 plus athletes, and I'm including myself because my use of Deca and sus together was in my mid 40s. Steve says quite properly in the pre-show, the over 40s, they rave about it because they feel better. When you're getting to an age, and it happens to all of us guys, when you're getting out of chairs, when you're finished in a long journey in a car, whatever else, when you're younger, it's nothing. You get out and you dance and you do crazy stuff or whatever else. When you get to a certain age, and it's just human nature, just normal stuff, you creak when you get up, you wake with certain situations, you feel if the wind changes, you can feel kind of creaky and achy and whatever else. And Deca is one of those drugs that the over 40s, the over 35s, and especially the over 50s, they're kind of like, yeah, I feel great on it. Those aches and pains are gone. The little niggles, and I mean the little niggles, not the worn joints, it's just the little niggles disappear, and they love it. And I certainly might say, but at 280 to 300 pounds, when I was peaking in my strength, I wasn't really having those aches and pains I do now, but I didn't really in those days. And I combined with stuff I thought was amazing. Now, Steve, what about the under 40s and the potential issue? And it is a potential issue, as you know, because we've discussed this already, for Deca. But that applies to NPP as much as it does not.
So here's the thing with Deca. I'm going to tell you guys exactly why the premise behind Deca happens. And I'm going to explain to you why the younger generation, my theory as to why younger guys, most of you who listen to this, you know, obviously, you know, you're between 20 and 55. And we have a lot of 20 somethings that listen to this, a lot of 30 somethings, 40 somethings, 50 somethings, and even guys in the 60s are listening to this show. So there may be, you know, a generational gap with using nandrolones, and the younger guys may steer away from it. So, you know, we'll talk about why in a second, but let me explain Deca. Let me explain why Deca happens to some guys out there. Number one, a lot of it is psychological. We know that. A lot of times when you're talking about, you know, your sexual health, a lot of it is psychological. When you first meet someone and, oh my God, you're in love with them, you can't get enough of them. I mean, it's like, boom, you can get it up like right away. There is no Deca, no erectile problems at all. Then you start dating them for a few months and the attraction might drop a little bit. The excitement might drop a little bit, and you might start having some issues in that department. So a lot of it is psychological. Yep. And then you break up for a year, and then a year later you hook up one night and the sex is fantastic again. Like, what the hell just happened? It's the same chick that you were sick of a year ago, but now the sex happens all the time. It's definitely psychological. So that's part of it. But the other part of it from the scientific nature is that when you're running a nandrolone, nandrolones convert to what's called dihydronandrolone in the body, DHN. And what happens is if that floods your body, it will offset DHT in the body. So if you're sensitive to DHT, now those of you who have ever run Proviron and you've noticed, oh my God, I get rock hard boners on Proviron, I get sexual boosts in Proviron. It's like instantly within days on Proviron, you get that boost. You're going to be most sensitive to the other direction of running nandrolones, because what happens is you get the opposite effect. You don't get DHT go up when you run nandrolones, you get DHN go up. So I've always said, okay, for the past decade on forums and on these podcasts, the way you offset any chance of Deca happening is all you got to do on cycle is run a DHT derivative with the nandrolone. So in this case, for every 100 milligrams of nandrolone a week that you're going to run, I want you to run 10 milligrams of Proviron. So if you run 500 milligrams of nandrolone, then you're going to run 50 milligrams of Proviron, and that will balance things out, and you won't have to worry about Deca. Now, the third shot thing is the younger generation. All this that I'm saying has caused the younger guys to be like, oh my God, I don't want to run Deca. I'm scared of Deca. Yeah. And, you know, there's no reason to be scared of it. If you run it correctly, the way we're going to tell you to run it and give you ideas on running, you won't have any issues. You'll love Deca. Deca will make you feel great. Your mood will feel great. Your sexual health should feel great on it. It did for me. It did for Mobster. Our sexual health was fine on Deca. It will make you have a boost in appetite. So if you want to bulk, it's a great option. If you want to do strength, it's a great option. So it really is a great steroid, and it doesn't cause these devastating side effects that other guys experience with other steroids. So we'll talk about how to stack in a bit. So I'll bring back Mobster back in. What do you think about that, and add to what I said?
I agree 100%. As Steve says, I was giving some rather crude off-air descriptions to Steve just to illustrate. I mean, as a plus 40 person at the time when I used Deca, as I say, the longer acting version instead of NPP, my libido remained the same as it was before. I wasn't, in fact, as Steve knows, I was more sexually active off drugs when I came here to Wales, and I don't think I'd done any kind of cycles for a while. than I was when I was on drugs in Gloucester. I was busy, I was competing, there was stuff going on. I ended up with my head up my ass, mental depression, whatever, towards the end of my time there for various reasons. And my libido stayed the same throughout the whole time. There's no change in frequency, etc., etc. When I come up here with no steroids, no performance enhancing drugs, no intention of competing, etc., etc., I rediscovered my sexual urges when it came to women, because the physical stuff that I was doing for myself, so to put it, stayed the same, as I say already. So to me, the nitty gritty of that, guys, is there's an enormous, there's two things really. One is the psychological. If you took Deca or NPP and struggled one day to get it hard on, it's not the end of the world, guys. It's one day, it's one time. And as Steve said, if there was a situation where you are in what's called the honeymoon period, so to put it crudely again, you're shagging, you want to breathe her breath in. You are so obsessed with this new girl. Maybe you're newly married, maybe it's just your dream lover or whatever. Then you can't stand to be away from her. That she's only got to look at you in the supermarket and you get a boner. And now you take Deca, and that doesn't happen one time. So what? It's so psychological. There's something I described to Steve, and that this, whether you're on Deca or NPP or not, all right? So the nature makes these changes to your body for particular reasons. If, for example, you were shagging like in the honeymoon period when it could be 6 times a day, 7 days a week, if you continue to do that, guys, you'd wear yourself out, and it would be too much. The feeling and the sensation to the emotions would be too much. So it's fantastic, but it's normal for that stuff to ease off. Don't confuse that and maybe like a one-time can't get a hard on, especially if you're shagging like it's going out of fashion, because you used a form of Deca. Because Decanate, whether the short or longer acting version, it's just normal. And I'll give you an example, guys. As I said to Steve in the pre-show, scientific stuff, you can look this up, it's not bullshit. Testosterone levels adjust in accordance to your situation. So I went with normal levels of libido, came up here and shagged everything within 40 miles, 5 in a week, 2 in a day, yada, yada, yada. I've come right down from that situation. My testosterone levels, no doubt, adjusted. If you go from a promiscuous situation, as I said for myself just then, to, for example, becoming a father and wanting to live with and or marry the lady in question, your testosterone levels will naturally adjust downwards. Otherwise, what would happen with all men, not just a few, but all men, would be that you will be living with this woman, father of the child, but still out chasing skirt. Now, some fellas are like that, but most of us calm down, and that's perfectly normal. So it's very, very easy, and it's especially addressing you younger guys. The older guys should know this stuff already. As the younger guys, it's unbelievably connected to the psychological and mental versus the physical. If you're fit, if you're strong, if you're training, if your nutrition's on point, there would have to be something the matter with you for it to be an issue. And it's not necessarily Deca. So look at what else you're doing. If you use another recreational drugs, if you're training like a madman for a competition, if your diet has you hungry all the time, if your work levels are crazy, if you're doing tons of overtime, if your stress is all over the place, don't blame the Deca. It's that. If you've got a death in the family, you've got someone seriously ill, your head's messed up every single day, don't blame the Deca. It's that. So keep that in mind, guys. The psychological, the mental is a huge part of how our body responds sexually. You might, and we've actually said this on the forum, slightly tongue-in-cheek, Steve, sometimes you just fall out of love. Sometimes that person just actually so much every single day that you have to take a step back. And then as Steve said, you can see the same person 6 months, 8 months later, hook up again, and it's like you back to that honeymoon period all over again. And that proves just how physical the mental stuff is, and how not, seeing it every single day versus not seeing it, suddenly the hunger comes back, and so on and so forth. So guys, that's just a quick word of advice for you. In terms of dosing, Steve, I've run the numbers on this before. My sus Deca cycle, I think, totaled 675 or 765 milligrams a week. That's the highest amount of any performance enhancing drugs I've ever run. And Deca, as Steve said already, the great advantage, especially for the golden holders, and for me on Deca versus NPP again, was only needing to dose twice a week I believe Monday and a Thursday in that particular case versus NPP, which I'd probably need to put dose 3 times a week. And again, I'm not a fan of pinning too frequently. If I don't have to, I won't. So yeah, I'd probably choose Deca over NPP, if only for that reason. But as Steve said, again, there will always be situations when you want to adjust dosages, when you want to be pinning more frequently, when you want the half-life to be shorter, and NPP is a great choice in that situation. Back to you.
Let's go over some cycle ideas that I have. So, you know, one of the most basic ways to run it is you can use some testosterone, quote unquote, as your base. Even though you don't need to run testosterone as your base, that's a myth. But in this case, you can run, say, 100 or 125 milligrams a week of testosterone. Short-acting testosterone or long-acting testosterone really doesn't matter in this case. And then you use the NPP, you know, between 300 to 400 milligrams. That would be an average dose per week. And then you can pin the testosterone. If you're using a testosterone propionate, you would pin it, you know, every other day or 3 times a week. And then the NPP, you want to pin it 2 to 3 times a week. That would suffice. And then, as I said earlier, you run a proviron with it. So the more of the NPP you're going to run, the more proviron you run. So in this case, you're going to run 30 to 40 milligrams of proviron. And if you don't have that available in 10 milligrams, you would run, if you just have 25 milligrams, then you would run it somewhere between 25 and 50 milligrams, either 1 or 2 proviron a day. And that would be stack number 1. So jump in Mobster with that. I'll give you a couple more stacks.
My thought process is, Steve, is if I'm going to run NPP as a shorter, still 4.5 day half-life, acting ester, then I'm probably going to want to run a shorter acting, shorter half-life form of test with it. Because, I mean, I say this all the time, guys. When I structure a cycle, for me, there has to be specifics. I'm looking to gain strength. Therefore, what drugs am I going to use? It's going to be strength enhancing drugs. I don't need to put on another 10 or 15 pounds, so I don't need anything that's going to bulk me up. And again, in this is an example. If my choice was therefore something that I could have in my system for a shorter period of time, then the testosterone that I'm going to choose to go with it would probably be the same. Because after all, why would I want something that's long acting on one side and short acting on the other? The only time, and it wouldn't apply to me specifically for my strength and what I'm after for, would be for, say, for example, we talked about this in previous show, Steve, a competition cycle. And then again, that's one of the things NPP would be probably more useful again, because as Steve said already, shorter acting, and with competition, I can take it out. I'm going to know ahead of time how long it's going to take to leave my system. I'm going to know what's happening in regards to other drugs. And as I said on previous show, the idea being again, that by the time I start to decide if I was ever to do so, Steve, to compete as a bodybuilder, I would want to have experience of all the drugs that I'm going to put into my competition cycle in order to know how my body responds to them, to bring myself to, as best I possibly could, the peak of perfection on a day. Now, that sometimes can be very confusing, and that's why guys come on the forums and ask, even if they know the specific drugs, and it's especially true when you're doing multiple drugs and combinations to try and get it. And this is, of course, why gurus, even top professionals will use gurus, because it's very much being able to take a step back, seeing how the body responds, and manipulate those variables. Again, to hopefully thin skin, full thing, the muscles looking absolutely amazing, and you really, really pop it on stage. So for me, this would be, again, I would say, my thought process would always be, if I'm going to use something that's got relatively short half-life like NPP, then why would I want to use a long-acting testosterone for the same, it wouldn't make no sense to me. I want both those things to be sure. If I want the stuff in my system for longer, if I'm getting particular benefits out of a longer acting ester, then I'd probably use Deca over NPP. And again, I'm not a big fan of pinning, so you have those advantages. The bigger thing of it is, Steve, that both things are available, but as per the reference in the article that we're using to discuss here today, it was used by athletes. And I think when we say athletes, we're talking about runners and actual people that are on an athletic field versus guys that are looking to grow in the off season, etc., etc. It's just that Deca, the longer acting version, has always been, to the best of my knowledge, Steve, a more popular drug. Now, I know that NPP's got fans because I've seen them talking about it on the forum. But all things being considered, I think maybe the only possible other variable is, Steve, would be the age thing that we talked about before. Because ultimately, you're still going to get the benefits from both versions. But I think maybe the younger guys might be more likely to try NPP, whereas the older guys are going to know how they feel on Deca and stick with what they know. They're after that feel good. And especially, as Steve said, if it's that much longer to get out of the system, you're going to get the feel good factor that much longer. So that makes a lot of sense to me as well, Steve. Those two different versions, the short, the long.
So let me give you a couple more cycles that I really like. So in our last podcast, we talked about Anadrol. That was podcast 11, the IO podcast 11. We talked about Anadrol. And Anadrol is a great oral steroid, and it's a DHT derivative. So if you run Deca by itself with Anadrol, that would be a wonderful way to do it, because now you're covering up, you're getting that DHT effect from the Anadrol. So you could run the NPP for like 6 weeks and then run the Anadrol, say at 25 milligrams the whole way through with it. And that would be a really, really good cycle right there. If you want to bulk, that would be a great, great cycle. And that would be one of the few things that I ever tell you to stack with Anadrol, because Anadrol is not a great one to stack other things with because of the side effects. But Deca, this is where Deca, Nandrolone Phenylpropionate, NPP. We keep going back to talking about Deca, but because we're so used to calling it that. But Nandrolone Phenylpropionate, NPP, which is what we're talking about in this podcast, it stacks well with Anadrol for that reason. And Anadrol stacks really, really, really good with NPP. It's one of the few NPPs are one of the few steroids that I would ever tell you to stack with Anadrol. Now, the other steroid stack that I would tell you to run would be running trenbolone acetate and then NPP together. So you would do, say, 250 milligrams of each or 300 milligrams of each, somewhere around there. If it's your first time stacking them, what a great cycle to run together. And you could just run that cycle for like 6-7 weeks and you will have tremendous results. Like, you will have results across the board running them together. They stack beautifully. Now, a lot of people are gonna disagree with me and say, oh, you're not supposed to stack Trembolone with Deca. Oh, you're not supposed to stack Trembolone with NPP. You're not supposed to stack Trembolone with any Nandrolone at all. What are you crazy? It's just not true. They stack beautifully together. You're stacking an androgen like Trembolone with an anabolic mild compound like NPP. So it's perfect. It's perfect synergy to stack them together. So if you've experienced NPP before and you've experienced Trembolone before, give them both a shot running them together. And it's really simple, 250 or 300 of each per week, and you're good to go. And you'll have a tremendous cycle. You don't have to run it very long. You'll have great results in a short amount of time, in and out quick. Run the acetate and then run the NPP phenylpropionate. So, Mobster, why don't you touch on that a little bit? And also kind of finish out the podcast telling us your own experiences with Nandrolone and what happened with you. Like, for me, I noticed it was a mild compound, slow builder, keepable gains. I was able to put on strength. My appetite was up. There's a lot of good things that happen using Nandrolone for me, but kind of tell the audience before we wrap up what happened to you, and kind of say the positives about Nandrolone. Finish us off with that.
I'm tempted, Steve, as we talk about certain drugs in his various podcasts, and I say to myself, if I was a fan of Pinning more frequently, I can only imagine, especially earlier in my lifting career, my lifting lifetime, if you like, being on NPP, for example, and Anadrol at the same time, as Steve mentioned just now, that would be to me an amazing cycle. Fortunately for me, my personal experience was with the slower acting Deca and Sustanon. And as we say, Sustanon, which I mentioned already, is a combination of different esters. So my personal experience at the time, right, I didn't have joint issues at the time because I don't think I'd quite worn myself out, Steve. So it wasn't an issue for me in terms of it masking any particular pain. The only problem, and as I mentioned before, I went from a solid 280 pounds to 300 pounds. And I think that cycle was in total, I'm going to say 6 or 8 weeks. It's a long time ago. I was in my mid-40s and I'll be 58 in about 10 days' time. So we're talking 12, 13 years ago. But I'm thinking 6 to 8 weeks. and it was for a specific competition, and I blew up. In fact, I had a bet, an informal bet with a buddy of mine about the first person to get to £300. Now, he's a lot shorter than me, but he ended up with a virus in the last week. And I think I went from 200 to £300.1 for the win. And he come in blessed, I think he was like 297, 298. Slightly disconcerting because two other fellas turned up, one that was competing and his buddy, and one was £320 and his buddy was £330. So I've gone from yay, the winner, to sort of second and third. I didn't have a bet with those guys, but I lost on that particular level, psychologically, if nothing else. Yeah, I mean, do you know what the biggest problem was, Steve? Because I wasn't aiming to keep that muscle tissue. I wasn't aiming to keep that size. The biggest problem, the negative, was gaining 20 pounds in 6 to 8 weeks. And what do I mean by that, guys? My gym was in a warehouse across the road from my house. I lived in a little 2 up, 2 down, as we say here in the UK, a little terraced house at that time. And the gym was in the warehouse across the road, which we rented. Training was no problem. All my best lifts were done on that cycle. I don't think it'd be any different on NPP, the short acting versus the Deca that I used at the time. So my 190 bench press was done on that. Some of my best deadlifts were done around that period of time. Some of all the big international competitions, Steve, when I was going to America, when I was lifting at the Arnold's, when I was lifting in Georgia, when I was lifting in Spain, all of that stuff, the peak of my career, if you like, the expo work, all of that was done around that time. I can only think of a couple of things that came after. So in terms of my peak physical strength and the enormous amount of size put on for a brief period of time, it would have been on SUS and Deca. So NPP would be no difference in terms of the game. Biggest problem, as I say, was just literally walking up and down the stairs. I gained 20 pounds in 6 to 8 weeks. So walking up and down the stairs, it takes me, and I've addressed this on the forums recently, if I gain 5 pounds, I don't feel normal in terms of function and stretching, flexibility, cardiovascular, etc. It takes me about 90 days, Steve. It takes me about 3 months for my body to accommodate it in terms of bone, connective tissue, just being straight, good old-fashioned, comfortable, walking around. Now, I'm heavier right now than I was back then, and I've been heavier than I am right this minute. I've been 331. I was 313 yesterday, Friday. So I'm still heavier than then, but my body's got used to it. So the one negative for me, Steve, was huge size. Putting on a lot of weight very quickly, not needing to retain it. Otherwise, I'd have probably tried to keep a few of those pounds, just walking up and down the stairs, one flight, 20 steps up. It was just hard work. I wasn't used to it. And that was outside the gym. So you're not in training mode. So there's your positive and negatives. But actual in the gym stuff, probably my best ever. All-round combination of strength and power was around that time. I was with the right people. I was training with world-class athletes. The guys were coming down from all over the country, was kicking ass, basically. And most of those guys, even now, Steve, what's fascinating about that particular group at that particular time, while I was on SUS and Deca, is a lot of those guys are still national standard athletes. They're still out there kicking ass. Some of them have been on TV for MMA. Some of them are world-class martial artists. One or two of them have been to the World's Strongest Man competition and competed, and that was our group. So SUS, Deca, combination of huge size, lots of weight, lots of power, and being surrounded by those particular people. So yeah, definitely in an ass-kicking mode for me. I don't know necessarily that I was increasingly aggressive, etc., etc. Never had those particular issues, not really on any performance-enhancing drug. Let's just be down to my nature. So for me, yes, Steve, overall, I for me, and again, I was in my mid-40s then, in terms of the pain reduction and feeling good, like Steve said, there's us older gentlemen, the more mature athlete. Fantastic. So highly recommended. As far as I've said many times on the Steve, those combination of drugs was probably my favorite cycle ever. I know what I get out of Debo and Anavar. I know what I've had out of Halo testing and check drops in terms of competitions and stuff. SUS and Deca for me was an absolute golden cycle, and I think that the only reason I wouldn't want to use NPP is because everything else would be the same, is I just wouldn't want to pin more frequently. But it has the great advantage of being out your system quicker, less time overall.
I think it's good. Let me just say this. I'll let you finish. if if you're first time using Nandrolone, I think NPP is a smart choice just because it's out of your
Yes.
system a lot quicker. Because you got to remember, if you run the long version of Nandrolone Decadurabolin, or Nandrolone Decanate, as some people call it, it's going to take many weeks to clear your system once you stop, and you're not going to be able to start recovering until you come off of it. But NPP is going to be out of your system in about 3 weeks. So once you stop injecting it, 3 weeks later, it's going to be out of your system. Then your body can start, recovering. So I think it's a really smart choice, especially if you're new to using Nandrolones. And then from there, if you really like it, then you can switch over to Deca, at a later time. But so I think that's where the huge advantage is. So give it a shot. Give Nandrolone Phenylpropionate a shot. I think if more people did, they would really, really enjoy it. So yeah, finish this off.
I'll finish off. Steve's quite correct. And it's some piece of advice we give to you guys in this podcast before. And I've mentioned this when I've talked about competition cycle. You wanted to know how your body performs, how you respond, whether you have issues, whether you have side effects. You want to know all those things well in advance of doing a competition cycle. I don't want to be retaining water in the last few days of a bodybuilding competition, for example. I don't want to have issues where I'm super irritated, or the post-injection pain from a drug is awful and I can't handle it. And for example, the transomnia, I don't want to be doing a drug where the sweats are too much, and especially so if it's a longer acting version, as Steve said. So it's a great piece of advice there, Steve, that for all arguments, if you've not used a version of a drug before and you want to know how you're going to respond to it, then a shorter acting, quicker in and quicker out makes a lot of sense, Steve, for that particular reason. And then as Steve says, if you find out that you do really well on it, it ends up being one of your favorite kind of drugs, then take the longer acting version. The only time that if any of those things might be a potential issue, I can only think of one or two, and I don't think it really applies in this example, would be if you're tested, because I think both versions are equally as bad in terms of getting you caught, Steve. I don't think there's really an issue here. And I'm happy to be corrected by listeners with regards to testing. I think both drugs are going to be quite easy to find. You really don't want to use them if you're in a drug tested situation. And I don't think it makes any particular difference whether it's a short or a longer acting version, because of the length of time that you can be tested for. Back in the day would have done, Steve, the shorter acting version of the quicker acting system, and therefore would be less likely to sharpen the test. But as I said in other podcasts, Steve, go back 2 years now with B samples, guys, and they're just getting better and better and better. So the idea that you're using a shorter active version just as a way of avoiding the tests, as we would say here in the United Kingdom, it's a mug's game. It's not going to make any difference. It would have done, but it doesn't anymore. Overall, for me, and I think Steve as well, NPP, whether it's the short acting NPP or the longer acting Deca, great drug. One of my favorites. All things being equal, my preference would be for the longer acting, purely and simply because that's where my experience is. But if I was a new guy, I would try NPP. Overall results would be the same. And for me, it's definitely one of my favorites. I said it a million times. You won't hear me say any different. And you're welcome to come and check out in the forums to see what I've said for longer versions of this conversation about my personal experiences, etc., etc. I think that's it, Steve. Shall we go to the disclaimer?
Yep, hit it.
Right. Please note, guys, we're not doctors, and our opinions are ours and ours alone. It is our view and based on our experience and views on the topic, a podcast of informational purpose and entertainment only. The freedom of speech as the First Amendment applies.